At a wedding meant to be perfect, 11-year-old Ethan does the unthinkable. He steps forward and hands the groom, Noah, a note that changes everything. The words, "Will you be my dad?" In front of a room full of guests, Noah's answer isn't just a promise, it's a life-changing moment. But can Ethan truly believe it? Can love be that simple? Stay until the end to find out. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. The wedding hall shimmered under the glow of golden chandeliers, their light casting delicate patterns across the polished marble floor. A soft melody from a string quartet floated through the air, mingling with the scent of fresh roses and jasmine. Every detail had been meticulously arranged. The elegant white and gold decor, the cascading floral arrangements lining the aisle, the flickering candlelight that bathed the space in warmth. It was the kind of wedding that people would remember. The kind that felt like a perfect fairy tale. At the center of it all stood Noah, the groom. His dark navy suit was perfectly tailored, the crisp white of his shirt making his deep brown eyes seem even darker under the warm lighting. He was composed, the kind of man who carried himself with quiet confidence, yet those who knew him well could spot the subtle signs of tension, the way his fingers tapped lightly against his thigh, the way his jaw tensed for just a fraction of a second. It wasn't nerves, not really. It was something deeper. Anticipation, maybe. The weight of the moment pressing down on him. Beside him stood Olivia, radiant in an ivory gown that hugged her slender frame before cascading into soft folds of silk and lace. The dress was breathtaking, embroidered with delicate floral patterns that shimmered under the light. But it was more than just a gown. It was a piece of her past, stitched together with memories. Sewn into the hem was lace from her late mother's wedding dress, a reminder of the woman who had once whispered dreams of a future filled with love and happiness. Olivia's dark curls had been pinned back, a few loose strands framing her face, and her warm brown eyes sparkled with emotion as she held Noah's hands in hers. This was her moment, a new beginning. But a few feet away, slightly apart from the altar, stood 11-year-old Ethan. Dressed in a miniature version of Noah's suit, his tie slightly askew from his own impatient adjustments, he looked the part of the well-dressed page boy. But he was the only one in the room who did not share in the joy that filled the space. His small hands were clenched at his sides, his shoulders stiff, his dark eyes fixed on the floor, as if he were willing himself to disappear, unlike the guests who watched the ceremony with warm smiles and misty eyes. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. A storm brewed beneath his quiet exterior, emotions clashing inside him, forming a weight that pressed against his chest so tightly he could hardly breathe. He didn't belong here. Not in this room filled with people who whispered soft congratulations. Not in this carefully curated world of poised elegance and orchestrated happiness. His mother had always fit in effortlessly, floating through life with a grace that made it seem easy, natural. But Ethan had always felt like an outsider, a puzzle piece forced into a space that didn't quite match its shape. For months, Olivia had reassured him. She had told him that Noah was a good man, that he cared for both of them, that he wanted to be part of their lives. But words meant little when fear whispered doubts into his mind. His father had once stood beside Olivia the way Noah did now. He had once held her hand with the same promise of forever, and yet he was gone. Ethan had been too young to understand what it meant when his father had died, too young to process the quiet grief that had settled into their home like an unspoken presence. He had felt it, though, in the way Olivia sat alone in the evenings, in the way she touched the old photographs when she thought no one was watching, in the way she had held him just a little too tightly when she tucked him in at night and whispered, "You'll always have me." But now she wasn't just his anymore. The officiant cleared his throat, his warm voice drawing the room's attention as he began the ceremony. Olivia and Noah turned to face each other, their hands still entwined. Noah spoke first, his deep voice steady as he recited his vows. He promised to love and cherish Olivia, to stand beside her through every challenge life would bring, to be her partner in all things. His words were not rehearsed, not empty poetry. They were a choice, deliberate and unwavering. Olivia's gaze softened, her grip on Noah's hands tightening slightly as if grounding herself in the reality of what this day meant. She prepared to speak her vows in return, but Ethan barely heard any of it. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the words, drowning out the music, drowning out everything except the weight of the small folded paper hidden inside his jacket pocket. He had written it the night before, sitting on his bed, staring at the blank page for what felt like hours before finally picking up his pen. He had thought about keeping it simple, just one sentence, just one question. The same question that had been haunting him ever since Noah entered their lives. Now, as Noah reached into his pocket and pulled out the wedding band meant for Olivia, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew what came next, the final step, the moment where Noah would slide the ring onto Olivia's finger, sealing the vow, binding them together in a way that could not be undone. His fingers curled around the note in his pocket, feeling the paper crinkle beneath his grip. And then, before he could stop himself, before fear could creep in and steal his voice, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. Wait. The word cut through the hall, sharp and sudden. The music halted, the officiant's words died on his lips. Every head turned in his direction, eyes widening in confusion, in shock. Noah froze, the ring still held between his fingers. Olivia's brows furrowed, her lips parting slightly, as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst, but he didn't waver. He took another step forward, his hands trembling, his breath shaky. All eyes were on him now, the weight of their gazes pressing down on him. But he didn't look at them. His eyes were locked on Noah, on the man who stood between him and the fear that had haunted him for months. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the small folded note. His fingers felt clumsy as he unfolded it, but his resolve didn't falter. The hall remained silent as he extended the paper toward Noah, his grip tight, his knuckles white. Olivia took a step toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan?" But he didn't look at her. Noah hesitated for only a second before reaching out, taking the paper from the boy's hand. He held it carefully, his expression unreadable as he began to unfold it. Ethan didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Because whatever happened next, whatever words Noah spoke, whatever expression crossed his face when he read those few simple words, it would change everything. Noah's fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper, the soft rustle of it filling the heavy silence that had overtaken the wedding hall. Every eye in the room was locked onto him and Ethan, the tension hanging so thick that even the flickering candlelight seemed frozen in place. Olivia's breath hitched, her hand pressed lightly against her chest as she took a hesitant step forward. She had no idea what was written on that note, but the sheer weight of the moment made her heart pound painfully against her ribs. Ethan stood still, his small shoulders squared, his jaw set in quiet determination, but his fingers twitched at his sides, a tiny sign that beneath the defiance he was terrified. His dark eyes never left Noah's face, searching for the answer he had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Noah's gaze dropped to the note, scanning the words written in slightly uneven, careful letters. His breath caught in his throat, and his grip on the paper tightened ever so slightly. "Will you be my dad?" A sharp gasp broke through the silence, followed by a ripple of murmurs from the guests. Some exchanged stunned glances, others craned their necks to get a better view. Olivia's vision blurred for a moment as the realization crashed over her like a wave. Her son, her sweet, guarded boy, had been holding on to this fear, this longing, and she hadn't even seen it fully until now. Noah swallowed hard. His entire body tensed as emotion surged through him, crashing into him like a force of nature he hadn't been prepared for. He had spent months trying to connect with Ethan, trying to show him that he wasn't just another man passing through his life. He had been patient, never pushing too hard, never demanding more than Ethan was willing to give, and yet, in the middle of the most significant moment of his life, the boy he had been waiting for had finally spoken. Not with words, but with something far more powerful. A plea. Noah lifted his gaze slowly, his brown eyes meeting Ethan's with an intensity that made the boy's breath hitch. The world around them disappeared. The guests, the wedding, the perfectly planned details, all of it faded into the background. "Ethan?" Olivia's voice was barely above a whisper, uncertain, filled with so much emotion that it nearly broke. She took another step toward him, her fingers shaking, but she hesitated. Then finally turned his head slightly, glancing at his mother. "I'm not joking," he said softly, his voice steadier than she had ever heard it. The weight of those words settled over her, over Noah, over the entire room. It wasn't a child's impulsive outburst. It wasn't a plea for attention or a moment of rebellion. It was something that had been sitting inside him for far too long, waiting for the right moment to surface. Noah exhaled slowly, his mind reeling. He thought of the first time he had met Ethan, the way the boy had watched him, always observing, always assessing. He thought of the quiet mornings at the breakfast table, where Ethan would sit across from him but never quite meet his eyes. The moments in the living room where their gazes would briefly lock before Ethan would quickly look away. The hesitation in the boy's voice whenever he addressed him, as if afraid of acknowledging what might never be real. And now, here he was, in front of a room full of people, asking for something bigger than any vow Noah could have ever spoken. For the first time, Ethan's hands clenched at his sides, his small body rigid, bracing himself for whatever would come next. Rejection. Disappointment. The cold, quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, he had asked for too much. Noah felt his chest tighten. He knew that fear. He recognized it, because he had seen it before, on his own face, in the mirror, when he had been younger, afraid of losing people who mattered. He understood the walls Ethan had built, the careful distance he kept, the way he hesitated before letting himself believe in something good. Without hesitation, Noah let the note slip from his fingers, letting it flutter to the floor. And then he moved. The action was sudden, unexpected. Ethan stiffened, his breath catching as Noah stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. The boy's dark eyes widened slightly, but he didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't step back. Noah knelt down, lowering himself to Ethan's level, his hands firm but gentle as he reached out and pulled the boy into his arms. A collective gasp swept through the room, but Noah barely registered it. He felt the sharp inhale of Ethan's breath against his shoulder, the way his small frame remained stiff, frozen in place. And then, after a long, agonizing moment, Ethan's hands lifted. Slowly, hesitantly. Then, all at once, his fingers curled tightly into the fabric of Noah's suit, gripping onto him as though he were afraid to let go. A shuddering breath left Olivia's lips as she pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The wedding had come to a complete standstill, but no one dared to move. No one dared to speak. Every single guest stood frozen, witnessing something far more profound than a marriage. This wasn't just about vows anymore. It wasn't just about love between two people. This was about a boy who had spent his whole life waiting for someone to stay. Noah tightened his arms around Ethan, pressing his chin lightly against the top of the boy's head. His voice, steady yet thick with emotion, barely rose above a whisper. "You don't even have to ask." Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in his life, he felt something solid, something unshakable. He felt home. The murmur of voices began to swell again, quiet at first, then growing as the realization of what had just happened settled over the crowd. Some guests wiped their eyes, others exchanged stunned glances. This was no ordinary wedding. This was something else. Something raw, something that would be remembered for reasons far beyond the perfectly arranged decorations or the carefully chosen vows. Noah slowly pulled back just enough to look Ethan in the eyes, his hands still resting on the boy's shoulders. Ethan's expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between disbelief and something far more fragile. Hope. Noah offered him a small, firm nod, as if silently reassuring him that this wasn't just a moment, that this wasn't just because people were watching. This was real. A breathless silence stretched between them before Ethan gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod in return. Olivia took a shaky step forward, finally reaching out, her fingers brushing lightly against Ethan's back. "Sweetheart," she murmured. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to glance at her, but he didn't pull away from Noah. For the first time, there was no hesitation in his movements. Noah rose to his feet, his hand resting protectively on Ethan's back. The note still lay, forgotten on the floor, but its message had already changed everything. The officiant, who had remained respectfully silent throughout the exchange, finally cleared his throat softly. If we are ready to continue?" His voice carried no impatience, only quiet understanding. Noah glanced at Olivia, at the unspoken emotions flickering in her gaze. He reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers, grounding her just as much as she grounded him. Ethan hesitated for a moment before shifting slightly, stepping just a little closer to Noah's side. The wedding had changed, but in the best way possible. And as Noah turned back to the officiant, a slow, steady smile tugging at the corners of his lips, he knew without a doubt that this wasn't just a wedding anymore. This was the beginning of a family, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever going to change that. The wedding hall, once filled with soft melodies and whispered admiration, now buzzed with an entirely different kind of energy. One thick with emotion, charged with something far more profound than simple vows and exchanged rings. The guests had come expecting a perfect ceremony, a flawless union between two people deeply in love. Instead, they had witnessed something raw, something unplanned, but infinitely more powerful. Noah stood motionless, his gaze locked on the small, crumpled note still resting on the floor. The weight of it was immeasurable, despite its size. It was just a few words, scrawled in a boy's unsteady handwriting, but it had altered the course of everything. "Will you be my dad?" His heart clenched as he replayed the moment in his mind. Ethan stepping forward, his voice cutting through the ceremony like a blade, the way his small hands had trembled when he had extended the note. That wasn't the kind of question a child asked lightly. It was a question born from fear, from uncertainty, from years of wondering if he would always be just a boy with a mother, with no one else to claim him as their own. Beside him, Olivia stood still, her fingers curled tightly around Noah's hand as if afraid that, without that anchor, she might drift away. She hadn't spoken since Ethan had made his request, her throat too tight, her emotions an unsteady storm just beneath the surface. She had always known her son struggled with change, that he had kept his distance from Noah even as she reassured him time and time again that this man would stay, that this man was different, but she had underestimated just how deeply Ethan had needed to hear it. In Noah's own words, in his own voice. Ethan, however, was completely still. He had not moved since Noah had pulled him into that embrace, had barely breathed since Noah had whispered, "You don't even have to ask." His dark eyes, usually so careful, so guarded, flickered between his mother and Noah, his expression unreadable. It was as if he were waiting for something to go wrong, waiting for someone to take it back, waiting for the world to shift beneath his feet once more. A slow murmur rippled through the guests, low conversations blending into the ambient hum of uncertainty. The officiant, who had been frozen in place, cleared his throat softly, casting a careful glance at Noah and Olivia. If we are ready to continue," he asked, his voice hesitant, understanding. Noah finally tore his gaze away from the note and looked down at Ethan, whose small fingers still clung faintly to the fabric of his suit jacket. The boy's expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders, the tight press of his lips, told Noah everything he needed to know. He was still waiting. Still unsure, still afraid. Noah let out a slow breath, and then, in one deliberate movement, bent down and picked up the discarded note from the floor. He brushed his thumb over the creased edges, smoothing it carefully before folding it with precision. Then, without hesitation, he slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, pressing his palm over the fabric as if sealing a vow. Ethan's eyes flickered slightly, his lips parting just a fraction. Noah crouched again, leveling himself with the boy. His voice was steady, quiet, but unshakable. "This isn't going anywhere," he said, tapping his pocket. "And neither am I." Something flickered in Ethan's gaze, so brief that if Noah had blinked, he might have missed it. Not quite belief, not quite relief, but something dangerously close. Noah extended a hand, not forcing, just offering. "Are we okay?" he asked softly. Ethan stared at the outstretched hand, his throat working as if swallowing down something heavy. For a moment, everything held still again. The guests, the candles, the world around them. Then, with a small but deliberate motion, Ethan reached out. His fingers, smaller and lighter than Noah had expected, curled around Noah's hand, and a breath that Noah hadn't even realized he was holding finally slipped from his lips. The pressure of that tiny grip felt more significant than any vow he had ever spoken. Olivia let out a quiet, unsteady breath of her own, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. The officiant, seeming to sense that the weight in the room had shifted, smiled gently and turned his attention back to the ceremony. "Then, if we may continue," he said, his voice warm, careful, as though he too understood that this wedding had just become about far more than a marriage. Noah didn't release Ethan's hand. not when he turned back to Olivia, not when he took the wedding band from the small velvet box, not when he slid it gently onto her waiting finger. And when the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, when applause erupted through the hall, filled with emotion deeper than any of them had anticipated, Ethan's small hand remained wrapped tightly in Noah's. The applause should have been deafening, but to Ethan, the sound faded into the background. The moment had passed, the ceremony moving forward as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just unraveled everything in front of an entire room of people, and yet, the hand in his, the warmth, the steadiness, the weight of it, was real. Noah had said yes, and for the first time, Ethan wondered if maybe, just maybe, that answer wouldn't change when the night was over. As guests rose from their seats, laughter and conversations filling the air once again, Olivia reached for Ethan, brushing a gentle hand over his back. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice so soft that only he could hear. Ethan hesitated, the question sitting heavy in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was okay. The part of him that had spent years bracing for disappointment still whispered doubts into his mind. But when he looked up at Noah, at the way the man stood beside Olivia with unwavering steadiness, at the way he kept Ethan close, not just as an afterthought but as something permanent, he felt something loosen inside him, just a little. "Yeah," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I think so." Noah turned toward him at the sound of his voice, and something unspoken passed between them. A silent understanding, a quiet promise. The reception hall opened, inviting guests inside with the soft hum of music and the clinking of glasses. People moved in pairs and small groups, their faces still glowing with the aftershocks of the ceremony. But Ethan barely noticed. His world had shrunk down to 3 people: his mother, the man she had just married, and himself. As they stepped forward together, Ethan's grip on Noah's hand loosened just slightly, but he didn't let go. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And as they walked through the grand doors of the reception hall into the beginning of something new, Ethan took a breath. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel so heavy. The reception hall was alive with celebration. Golden lights shimmered against the polished floors, the soft hum of music weaving through conversations and bursts of laughter. Guests clinked their glasses in quiet toasts, their eyes still reflecting the raw emotion of the ceremony they had just witnessed. Servers moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne and elegantly plated hors d'oeuvres. Le Pala. The energy in the room was warm, filled with love and happiness, but at the center of it all, Ethan felt strangely disconnected from the joy around him. He sat at one of the round tables near the edge of the room, pushing the food on his plate around with his fork, barely touching it. Across the table, Olivia was speaking softly to a relative, her laughter light but fleeting, her eyes flickering to him every few minutes. She was watching him. He could feel it. Ethan had spent years mastering the art of staying small, of avoiding unwanted attention. But tonight, he had shattered that. Tonight, he had done something he had never thought himself capable of. He had asked for something. Not in passing, not indirectly, but boldly, in front of an entire room of people. The moment replayed in his mind over and over again. The way his voice had cut through the ceremony. The way everyone had turned to look at him. The way Noah had unfolded that tiny note with careful hands. The way Noah had held him afterward. It had been real, hadn't it? Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, his stomach tight with uncertainty. He wasn't sure what he had expected. A rejection, maybe? An awkward conversation later, explaining why things couldn't be the way he wanted them to be? But Noah had said yes. Noah had told him he didn't even have to ask. So why did it still feel like he was waiting for something to go wrong? A shadow fell over him, and Ethan looked up just in time to see Noah approaching the table, his suit jacket now gone, his sleeves rolled up casually. He held a small plate of food in one hand, his other tucked into his pocket as he moved with the same steady confidence he always had, but his eyes, dark and watchful, were focused on Ethan. "Not hungry?" Noah asked, nodding toward Ethan's barely touched plate as he set his own down across from him. Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess." Noah didn't push. He simply nodded, picking up his fork and taking a few slow bites of his own food. It was something Ethan had started to notice about him, not just tonight, but over the past few months. Noah never forced conversations. He never pried. He gave Ethan space to decide when he wanted to talk. And yet, somehow, that made Ethan want to talk more. The table was quiet for a few minutes, the sounds of the reception carrying on around them. Olivia glanced over once, but when she saw Noah sitting there, she turned back to her conversation, giving them space. Ethan fidgeted slightly in his seat, his fingers tapping against the fabric of his pants. His mind was a storm of tangled thoughts, a mess of emotions he wasn't sure how to sort through. But after a long silence, the words finally slipped out. Small and uncertain. "Did you mean it?" Noah paused mid-bite, setting his fork down. He didn't ask what Ethan meant. He didn't need to. "Yeah," Noah said simply. "I did." Ethan swallowed, his fingers tightening in his lap. He didn't know why the answer made his chest feel tight, why it made his throat burn in a way he didn't understand. He hesitated, then whispered, "You don't have to." Noah's brows furrowed slightly, his expression steady but softer now, as if he knew exactly what was going through Ethan's head. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Ethan, I don't say things I don't mean," he said, his voice calm, certain. "If I wasn't sure, I wouldn't have said it." Ethan dropped his gaze, staring hard at his plate. His heart was pounding, and he hated that it was. He had asked for this, he had wanted this, but wanting something and believing it could be real were two different things. He bit his lip, struggling for words. "Even if I'm not," he stopped himself before he could finish. "Even if I'm not enough." But Noah heard it anyway. The man exhaled slowly, leaning forward just a little more, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear. "You are," Noah said. "You always were." Ethan's breath hitched slightly. He didn't look up, but something inside him cracked, just a little. Noah didn't press any further. He didn't make a big deal out of it, didn't force Ethan to acknowledge it. He just sat there, giving Ethan space to let the words settle. And for the first time that night, Ethan let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, Noah meant it. The reception carried on, the sounds of music and laughter swirling around them, but Ethan felt strangely grounded for the first time that evening. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with this new feeling. It was unfamiliar, a little terrifying, but it wasn't bad. He shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers loosening. Then, almost hesitantly, he reached forward and picked up his fork, taking a small bite of his food. Noah didn't react, didn't comment on it. But out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw the smallest, quietest smile tug at the man's lips. And somehow, that made all the difference. The evening stretched on, filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The reception hall had transformed into a warm blur of movement and conversation, with guests celebrating, dancing, and exchanging stories. Yet for Ethan, everything still felt strangely distant, as if he were watching it all unfold from behind a glass wall. He sat at the same table, his plate now empty, though he hardly remembered eating. His mind was too full, thoughts circling in endless loops, replaying the moment over and over again. The moment he had stepped forward, the moment Noah had read the note, the moment Noah had said yes, so easily, so simply, as if the answer had never been in question. But was it really that easy? His hands curled into small fists in his lap, his stomach twisting. It had felt real at the time. Noah's words, his arms around him, the steady way he had said, "You don't even have to ask." But that had been in front of everyone, in the middle of a wedding. What if it had just been the moment? What if, now that everything was settling, Noah realized he had spoken too soon? Ethan had spent his whole life being careful, never asking for too much, never pushing too hard, because he had learned from experience that things could change in an instant. One day everything could be fine, and the next the ground could disappear from beneath him. A chair scraped against the floor, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked up just in time to see Noah sitting back down across from him, his jacket still missing, his sleeves still rolled up. He looked relaxed, like nothing about tonight had shaken him. Like this was just another evening. Ethan envied that. "You look like your brain's working overtime," Noah said, leaning back slightly. His voice was light, casual, but there was an undercurrent of understanding there. Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess." Noah didn't push. He never did. Instead, he drummed his fingers lightly against the table, watching Ethan carefully. "You want to get out of here for a minute?" Ethan blinked. "What?" "Not leave, Noah clarified with a small smile. "Just step outside for some air. You look like you could use it." Ethan hesitated. He glanced at Olivia, who was across the room talking to a group of relatives. She was still keeping an eye on him. He could tell by the way she kept shifting, her gaze flickering toward him every few minutes. But she trusted Noah, and Ethan realized, so did he. "Okay," he said quietly. Noah stood, giving him a small nod, and Ethan followed. The two of them weaved through the guests, unnoticed for the most part, except for a few warm smiles sent their way. Olivia caught sight of them just before they reached the exit, and though she looked concerned for a brief second, she gave Noah a small, approving nod. They stepped outside into the cool night air. The distant sounds of the city hummed in the background, but out here, everything felt quieter, calmer. Ethan inhaled deeply, letting the crispness of the evening settle in his lungs. Noah leaned against one of the wooden columns lining the reception hall's veranda, his hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything right away. He just let the silence exist, filling the space between them with something that wasn't uncomfortable, wasn't heavy, just there. Ethan shifted on his feet, kicking at an invisible pebble. His thoughts were still tangled, still looping over themselves. But for some reason, out here, away from the crowded hall, they felt a little easier to say. "Are you really going to do it?" Noah turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Do what?" Ethan swallowed. His hands twitched at his sides. He couldn't quite look at Noah when he spoke again. "Adopt me." The words felt heavier outside, without the buzz of conversation and music to drown them out. Noah was silent for a long moment. Not the bad kind of silence, the thinking kind. He didn't rush to answer, didn't say something just to fill the quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Yeah," he said, "if that's what you want." Ethan frowned slightly, his fingers tightening. "I already told you I wanted it." "I know," Noah said. "But I want to make sure you know that I do too." Ethan stared at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any sign that Noah might just be saying what he thought Ethan wanted to hear. But there was nothing, just quiet certainty. A lump formed in Ethan's throat, but he forced it down. "What if you change your mind?" he whispered. Noah exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Ethan." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. "People do that." Noah was quiet again. Then, after a moment, he pushed off the column and crouched slightly, leveling himself with Ethan's height, making sure the boy saw his face. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't sure," he said. Ethan's throat felt tight. He wanted to believe that. He really wanted to. But part of him was still bracing for disappointment, still waiting for something to go wrong. It always did. But then Noah reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. It was the note. Ethan's breath hitched slightly as Noah held it between his fingers, turning it over once before offering a small nod toward it. "I'm keeping this," he said simply. "Forever." Ethan stared at the note, his pulse quickening. It was stupid, but part of him had assumed Noah would have thrown it away. It had served its purpose after all. Ethan had asked, Noah had answered. What did it matter now? But he still had it. Noah saw something flicker across Ethan's face, because he smiled just slightly. "I don't hold on to things that don't matter," he said. Ethan's fingers twitched at his sides. His chest felt too tight again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else, something warmer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Ethan took a small step forward, just enough to close some of the distance between them. "Okay," he said quietly. Noah's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile, but close. He nodded once, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. And when they stepped back inside, Ethan still felt nervous. Still felt uncertain. But for the first time, the fear wasn't quite as loud. The wedding reception carried on as though nothing had happened. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, and the warm hum of conversation filled the space. But for Ethan, everything felt different. The world had shifted in a way that he couldn't quite explain, as if the air itself was heavier, thicker, full of something unspoken. He could still hear Noah's words echoing in his head. "I don't hold on to things that don't matter." The note. Noah still had it. He hadn't just read it, answered, and tossed it aside. He had kept it. And that simple act sat in Ethan's chest like an unfamiliar weight. Not heavy in a bad way, but something solid, something real. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He followed Noah back inside, back into the soft golden light of the reception hall, where people were swaying to the slow rhythm of a song he didn't recognize. Olivia was across the room, her hands clasped in quiet conversation with one of her aunts, but she caught Ethan's eye and gave him a small, reassuring smile. He looked away quickly. He knew she was still watching him, still waiting for some sign that he was okay. And maybe he was. Or maybe he was just trying to convince himself of that. Noah led him back to their table, the same one where Ethan had been sitting before, pushing food around his plate, feeling like an island in the middle of a celebration. But this time, Noah didn't sit across from him. He sat beside him, rolling up his sleeves a little more as if he were settling in for a long conversation. "You still look like you're thinking too hard," Noah said, his voice light but pointed. Ethan exhaled, staring down at his hands. He was thinking too hard. His mind wouldn't stop running, wouldn't stop trying to pick apart everything that had just happened. "People keep looking at me weird," Ethan muttered after a long pause. Noah raised an eyebrow, glancing around the room. "Weird how?" Ethan hesitated, trying to find the words. "Like they feel sorry for me, like they think I'm different now." Noah considered this, then leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly. "I don't think they feel sorry for you," he said. "I think they just saw something tonight that meant something to them." Ethan frowned, crossing his arms. "It wasn't that big of a deal." Noah let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "To you, maybe, but to the rest of us, it was huge." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't know how to respond. Noah turned slightly so he was facing him more directly, resting his arms on the table. "You let people see you tonight, the real you. That's not something most people can do." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He had spent so much time trying to not be seen, trying to be small, to take up as little space as possible. But tonight he had taken up space. He had spoken, asked for something, made himself vulnerable in a way he had never done before. And now people were looking at him like they knew him. And that made him uneasy. His gaze flickered toward Olivia, who was still across the room, laughing softly at something her sister had said. But even now her body was angled toward him, as if she was ready to step in the moment she thought he needed her. He had spent so much of his life being just hers, just Olivia's son, and that had been enough. Until now. Now there was Noah. Now there was someone else who had said without hesitation, "Yes, I want you too." But what if he didn't? What if, once the wedding was over and the guests had gone home, once the excitement of the night had faded into memory, Noah realized that saying yes was the easy part? What if he realized that keeping that promise was harder? Ethan let out a slow breath and pulled his knees up onto the chair, resting his chin on them. He felt Noah watching him, waiting, but not pushing. Finally, the words came out, barely above a whisper. "What if you regret it?" Noah went very still. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, the sounds of the reception buzzing softly around them. Then, without any hesitation, he reached into his pocket again, pulling out the small, folded note. He placed it on the table between them, tapping his finger against it lightly. "This," he said, "is a reminder that I—" Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. Noah's voice was calm, steady. "I don't make promises I don't plan on keeping, Ethan." He tapped the note again. This wasn't just a moment. It wasn't just about the wedding or the people watching. It was you. It was you being brave enough to ask for something that really mattered to you. And me? I was just lucky enough to be the person you asked. Ethan blinked rapidly, looking away. His chest felt too tight again, but for a completely different reason now. He didn't know what to say. Noah exhaled through his nose, sitting back in his chair. "Look, I get it," he said. "You don't have any reason to trust that I'll stay. People have let you down before. I know that. And nothing I say is going to magically make that fear go away overnight." Ethan's fingers curled slightly. He didn't like that Noah understood him so well. "But I can prove it," Noah continued, "not just with words, with actions, with time. He paused, then softened his voice. You don't have to believe me yet, but I'm not going anywhere, and I'll keep showing up until you believe that. Ethan let out a shaky breath, staring at the note on the table. He wanted to believe it, he really wanted to. But belief wasn't something you could force. It had to grow. He hesitated, then, almost reluctantly, reached out and touched the edge of the note with his fingertips. He didn't unfold it, didn't pick it up, just touched it. Noah saw the movement and didn't say anything. He just gave a small approving nod, as if to say, "That's enough for now." And for the first time that night, Ethan thought maybe, just maybe, it was. The night wore on, the reception gradually shifting from lively celebration to something quieter, more intimate. The music softened, and the guests who remained had settled into smaller groups, speaking in hushed voices, sipping their drinks, enjoying the last moments of the evening. The energy in the room had changed. It was no longer the bustling excitement of a wedding, but the comfortable hum of people lingering in the warmth of something meaningful. Ethan sat at the table, watching the flickering candlelight in the centerpiece, tracing invisible patterns on the tablecloth with his fingers. The weight of the night still clung to him, though it no longer felt as suffocating as before. He could still feel the note resting between his fingertips, though he had let go of it minutes ago. Noah sat beside him, his presence steady and unhurried. He wasn't looking at Ethan, wasn't watching him too closely, but he was there. That was something Ethan had started to notice about Noah. He never loomed, never hovered, but he was always there when it mattered. The silence between them stretched, comfortable in its own way. Then Noah leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, his voice low. You know, when I was a kid, I used to hate when people told me I was brave. Ethan blinked, glancing at him. Why? Noah exhaled through his nose, a small, almost amused sound. Because most of the time, I didn't feel brave. I felt scared. I felt like I was making the wrong choices or saying the wrong things. But then someone would call me brave, and I'd just sit there wondering what they saw that I didn't. Ah, Ethan frowned, shifting in his seat. He didn't like where this was going. He had heard too many variations of this speech before, the kind adults gave when they were trying to tell you how strong you were, how resilient. He hated that word, resilient. It just meant you'd been through things you shouldn't have had to survive. But Noah wasn't looking at him like that. He wasn't pitying him. He was just talking. I think bravery looks different depending on who's watching, Noah continued. To some people it looks like fighting battles. To others it looks like standing up for what's right. But the kind of bravery I respect the most, he turned slightly, meeting Ethan's gaze. It's the kind that doesn't look like bravery at all. It's the kind where someone asks for what they really want, even if they don't think they'll get it. Ethan's throat felt tight. He looked away. I didn't do anything brave, he muttered. Noah tilted his head. Didn't you? Ethan's fingers twitched. He wanted to argue, to push back, but he couldn't find the words. Noah exhaled, watching him carefully. It's scary to want something, he said. Even scarier to ask for it. Because what if you don't get it? What if it gets taken away? What if it hurts more than never asking at all? Ethan swallowed hard. Because that was what had been clawing at him all night. Not the embarrassment of interrupting the wedding, not the stares or the whispers or even the uncertainty of Noah's answer. It was the fear of what came after. The fear that now that he had asked, now that he had made himself want something, he had given the universe a new way to hurt him. Noah's voice was quieter now. "I get it, Ethan." Ethan's jaw clenched. "You think you do," he said, his voice coming out sharper than he meant it to. Noah didn't flinch. He just nodded, accepting the response for what it was. "Maybe," he said. "But I do know one thing for sure." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak. Noah leaned forward, lowering his voice even more. "The things worth having? The things that really matter? They're always scary at first." Ethan swallowed, his fingers curling into his palms. Noah let the silence stretch between them for a few moments before sitting back, exhaling slowly. "But you don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said. "You don't have to believe me yet. Just let it sit for a while." Ethan didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the candlelight, listening to the sound of laughter and conversation swirling around him. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself wonder, just for a second, what it would feel like to believe Noah. To believe that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't regret asking. The night had thinned out, the reception hall now quieter, filled only with the last lingering guests. The music had softened into a low hum in the background, and the warm glow of the chandeliers flickered gently over the remaining tables. Plates were left half empty, champagne glasses now only holding the remnants of celebratory toasts. Conversations had slowed, turning from laughter-filled excitement to quiet reflection. Ethan sat at the same table, his back against the chair, hands resting in his lap. His thoughts still felt tangled, but the storm inside him had quieted, at least a little. The night had been overwhelming, but now, as everything settled into something slower, softer, he could finally breathe. Noah was still beside him, his sleeves pushed up, his tie loosened. He didn't look tired, but he did look at peace, as if, despite everything that had happened tonight, this was exactly where he wanted to be. That thought made something in Ethan's chest tighten. Nearby, Olivia was standing at the exit, speaking quietly with her sister. She glanced over at Ethan every few moments, her expression soft but watchful. She was waiting for him, not rushing him, not pushing, just waiting. Noah noticed too. He let out a slow breath, then turned his attention back to Ethan. "It's getting late," he said, voice easy. "You ready to head home?" "How?" The word settled in Ethan's chest in a way that felt heavier than he expected. It wasn't like he hadn't thought of the house that way before. It was where he had grown up, after all. But for the first time, home didn't feel like just a place. It felt like a question, like something uncertain, something big. He hesitated, then gave a small nod. Noah stood first, stretching his arm slightly before reaching for his suit jacket, which had been draped over the back of his chair. Ethan followed suit, standing a little slower, his body still tense with the weight of the night. As they made their way toward the exit, Olivia caught his eye again, her lips curving into a small, relieved smile. Without a word, she reached out and smoothed a hand over his hair, a gesture so familiar that for a moment it was like nothing had changed at all. But everything had changed. The three of them stepped outside into the crisp night air. The streetlights glowed softly, casting long shadows along the pavement. Most of the guests had already left, their cars pulling away from the venue, leaving the parking lot nearly empty. The world felt quieter now, more still. Noah pulled out his car keys, unlocking the doors with a quick press of a button. The soft beep echoed into the night, breaking the silence for just a second. Olivia slid into the passenger seat while Ethan hesitated for just a moment before climbing into the back. The door closed behind him with a solid click, enclosing them in a space that felt almost safe. As Noah started the car, the low hum of the engine filled the silence. They pulled onto the road, the city lights passing by in a blur. Ethan leaned his head against the window, watching as the world moved past him. The night had felt endless, stretched out with so many emotions, so many moments he still wasn't sure how to process. A few minutes passed before Noah spoke. "You okay back there?" Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say yes, wanted to make it easy, but the truth felt heavier in his chest, and for some reason, tonight, he didn't feel like pretending. So instead, he whispered, "I think it's just weird." Noah glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "What is?" Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, pulling his knees up to his chest. He hesitated before finally admitting not being alone anymore. A beat of silence followed. Noah's grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly before he let out a slow, measured breath. "You were never alone, Ethan." His voice was quiet, steady, even when you felt like you were. Ethan swallowed, pressing his forehead against the cool glass of the window. He didn't know why those words made his chest ache. Why they made something deep inside him feel unsteady. Olivia reached back from the front seat, resting her hand on his knee for just a second before pulling away. "We're here now," she murmured, "and we're not going anywhere." The rest of the drive was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy kind of silence Ethan was used to. It wasn't the silence of loneliness, of feeling like something was missing. It was different. By the time they pulled into the driveway, exhaustion had settled deep into Ethan's bones. He barely registered as Olivia stepped out first, stretching slightly before making her way to the front door. Noah parked the car, unbuckling his seatbelt, but he didn't move to get out just yet. Instead, he turned slightly in his seat, looking over at Ethan. "You coming?" he asked, voice casual. Ethan hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. He pushed the car door open and stepped out, the cool night air wrapping around him as he followed Noah up the short walkway to the house. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the familiar front steps. Ethan had lived here his whole life, but as he walked through the front door, something about it felt different now. More solid, more real. Noah kicked off his shoes near the entrance, loosening his tie even more. Olivia disappeared into the bedroom, no doubt eager to change out of her dress. Ethan lingered near the doorway, unsure of what to do with himself. Noah must have noticed because he nodded toward the couch. "Want to sit for a bit?" Ethan hesitated, then gave a small nod. He followed Noah into the living room, sitting on the far end of the couch while Noah settled beside him. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a nearby lamp casting long shadows along the walls. For a while, they just sat there. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Then, after a long pause, Ethan finally broke the silence. "You're really going to do it, huh?" Noah turned to look at him, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Ethan swallowed. "You're not just saying that because of the wedding?" Noah's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. "No," he said. "I'm saying it because I mean it." Ethan looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting slightly in the fabric of his pants. He wanted to believe that. He really did. but a part of him still felt like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Noah seemed to understand that without Ethan having to say it. "It's okay if it takes time," Noah said, his voice quieter now. "I know this isn't something you can just believe overnight." Ethan exhaled slowly. They fell into silence again. Then, after a moment, Noah reached into his pocket. Ethan frowned slightly as Noah pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was the note. Noah held it between his fingers for a second before handing it to Ethan. Ethan hesitated before carefully unfolding it. There it was, his own shaky handwriting. "Will you be my dad?" Noah nodded toward it. "I'm keeping that," he said simply. "Forever." Ethan's fingers tightened around the paper, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep waiting for things to fall apart. Maybe this time they wouldn't. Maybe this time they would stay. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. It's not just a story about a wedding. It's a story about belonging, about taking a risk on love, and about the quiet bravery it takes to ask for what we truly need. Ethan's journey reminds us that sometimes the hardest thing isn't enduring loneliness. It's allowing ourselves to believe that someone wants to stay. Trust isn't built in a single moment. It's built over time, through actions, through patience, and through the unwavering presence of those who truly care. This story is a reminder that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stand beside us, the ones who prove, day after day, that they are here for the long haul. What about you? Where are you watching from? Have you ever had a moment in your life where you were afraid to ask for something important? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are so many more stories to tell. Stories about love, about resilience, about the incredible strength found in human connection. Until next time, thank you for being here.